All right, I'm Brian Shlonsky here with Leland Hulbert. We are on Wave now. We're talking a bit about the Crystal Rogers trial, trial number 2 in that case going on in Warren County. We've got a crew there sending us notes from the courtroom because, as we've mentioned several times, you can't bring cameras inside. So you and I have been reading through some of this today as testimony gets underway. Anything from today that's stood out to you so far?
Well, you've gotten your first crack at what these new defense attorneys are going to say. And so, Steve Schroering, I think, gave the opening, and he's with Brian Butler, and they're both very seasoned ex-prosecutors, now current defense attorneys. And they gave sort of a different spin than maybe the last attorneys did in the first trial. And they are attacking some of the cell tower data. They're attacking the tunnel vision from the police. So those things are fairly normal in a murder case where you don't have a body and you're relying so much on the police and witnesses. They're just attacking them and stating that the police had tunnel vision, which is a common defense theory. So I don't think they're doing anything remarkably unexpected, but I think it's a different sort of avenue than the first trial.
On that topic, you said one of the avenues that they have been attacking today was some of the cell data, and I've got some messages here from Alina Noakes, who's our reporter in the courtroom, and she goes into more detail about this. Basically, the defense claiming that the cell data is proving Steve Lawson, according to them, was never on the Bluegrass Parkway. He was on a different road, parallel, on the north side, and the phone pinging there is just the way that cell towers work. So if this were true, it would essentially dismiss everything that Steve Lawson's ever said.
Right. So cell data is interesting because most of the time a defense attorney will say, well, this is inaccurate, or they don't know exactly where it is. But they're using it the other way to say it's 100% accurate, and this shows that our client didn't do anything or that the prosecution case is incorrect. So the reality is it's somewhere in the middle. It's science and it's semi-accurate, but you're bouncing off towers. So it's nearby towers. I don't think you can pinpoint exactly within 10 feet where someone is. It's not a satellite photo or something you would see in a movie. But it does, typically cell tower pinging is kind of used to show a direction. So if you see 5 cell tower pings all going north, you can presume over 10 miles or whatever the car is going north. So obviously they've seen something in that data that they want to latch onto to show that the prosecution's claims are incorrect.
I guess the question coming out of that is then why in the world would his own defense have not argued that point in his own trial that happened last month?
That's a good question. There's other evidence against Steven Lawson, and a lot of it had to do with statements, and I think Steven Lawson himself admitted to some of those locations. So where anyone actually was, we don't know for sure. And if Steven Lawson's going to say, I was on the Bluegrass Parkway, or I was here, I was there, there's no reason for the prosecution to make a big deal about it if he's admitting it. Now, if this defense team wants to say it's inaccurate and Steven Lawson was lying or his car wasn't there, then that's why they're going to make a big deal about the data.
So my follow-up to that is, okay, so why in the world would Steven Lawson make a false confession then? I mean, he got found guilty. He is going to jail. What would be the point of that?
Well, I think he made multiple statements, and the jury heard that, and I think that over time, the more statements you make, the less likely anyone is to believe what you're saying. So I think it might just have something to do with how many statements did he give, how consistent was he with where the location was, when did that come out, was that the third statement, the fourth statement, the first statement, has he been consistent all along that he was there, or did he change his story?
Which is part of why he was included in his own trial away from these two that are on trial now, is because some of that wildly inconsistent testimony that he had given in the past.
Right, and he's not going to be allowed, that's why it was split up, he's not allowed to attack Houck's and Joseph Lawson unless he testifies, and all his statements couldn't be used against Houck and Lawson unless he testifies, and so they didn't know if that was going to happen, so they split him up. But will we see Steven Lawson? I would still say probably not, but you never know.
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people have been wondering too. Is he going to pop up in this second trial? I think as you look at this with an overall broad perspective on this case. A lot of people that are interested in true crime and watch a lot of movies, and you see everything's a slam dunk and comes together and the police solve it in this creative way. So looking at it in that regard, you're seeing this, what seems to be a bumbling cast of characters who are on the, on the witness stand, who are on trial here. And does the average person think, how in the world have they, if these folks are guilty of murder, does this cast of characters who can barely string together a coherent thought, are incriminating themselves on jail calls? How in the world, for a decade, do you get away with something like this?
Well, the missing body is a big part. In most murder cases, you have a medical examiner's report saying the cause of death is XYZ. Other times you have a murder weapon, you have ballistics, you can trace things back, and they didn't have those here. So they're going on building a case on what people are saying. And this, like you said, the statements have been wildly inconsistent at times, so building it's more difficult. You don't know who's telling the truth, so that's where you have to piece together what little physical evidence you have, the statements you have, the car, the hair, the phone, and once you put it all together and shake it out, is there enough evidence to find someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, there was for Steven Lawson, so presumably we're going to hear more. There's, this is just day one, but will there be any massive bombshell evidence that we haven't heard? I don't know.
On that topic, when you look at Brooks Houck, the boyfriend of Crystal Rogers, you talked about how his defense comes out day one and they start saying that the police and the investigators, the detectives, were narrow-minded. They were only zeroing in on him. You mentioned this is a normal tactic to be used by a defense team. For the prosecution, are they looking at this in a way of saying, okay, well, we're going to eliminate everyone else, so the evidence is going to show that it couldn't have been anyone else?
That's a popular way to travel on a circumstantial case. A lot of times I remember I've had an arson trial where if you eliminate all other people that could have set the fire, there's only one person left, the defendant. And sometimes that works in those type of cases. Now in a murder case where you have multiple people involved, multiple people who saw a body, people start looking for the closer connections and a motive. Who had an axe to grind? And there was some testimony, I think, that Houck's mom didn't like Crystal, and that Houck argued with Crystal and things like that. And, every Dateline you watch, it seems like it's always the spouse. So they're going to look there. The defense is going to argue that they only look there, started there, stopped there, and that's their problem. And the prosecution is going to argue we kept looking there because we believe he did it. So, it's how that will shake out, how much a jury will believe each side, we'll see.
One of the last things I want to ask you today before we get ready for some television coverage here today, when you look at some of the witnesses that are being called, and I know that the defense is going to call into their credibility, their drug use was brought up a lot in the last trial and things like that, how difficult is it if some of these statements weren't gathered 10 years ago when this happened to recall on memory for some of these folks that, some of the stuff we're talking about here are conversations, things said in passing, and somebody could argue, I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. How's somebody going to remember a random phone conversation from 10 years ago?
They're not, unless they've already have an Oxygen special, a Dateline special, an HBO special, and they've seen themselves on TV, and they've seen themselves quoted, and they've, this case is probably more fresh in their minds because their stories have been vetted 10 different ways.
Right.
So they know generally what questions they're going to be asked, and things that they may not have had a great memory of a few months later, they might have a better memory of now because they've said it so many times.
They've been asked
the
so
question,
many times.
Where's the car? When did you see her last? When did you talk to her? What did you text her? Well, when you're asked that by 6 different people, you remember that in your brain. So, that could be one reason they can recall so well. Because I agree, 10 years ago, people don't remember a whole lot unless they've been asked about it ad nauseum.
Especially if they didn't know it was tied to something at the time.
Right.
Right. Well, Leland, thank you as always for your expertise. It comes in handy trying to decipher all of this, especially not having cameras there. You bring a great expert lens to look at this through. So as always, we appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have much more on the Crystal Rogers trial number 2 on air and online. We'll see you there.